What I want to do is show you how the world looks in higher education. It's very hard to compare institutions. It's harder to compare countries, but this is the best we can do. Show you what the best performing systems show is possible to achieve, and then some of the lessons that we take from that. First of all, looking not to higher education, but to baseline qualification. This is how the world looked in the 1960s, with the proportion of people having attained sort of a baseline qualification like 5 good GCSEs or an equivalent vocational qualification. And then you could see in the 1970s, the world changed quite a bit in a number of countries. In the 1980s, change continued, and in the 1990s, countries progressed as well. And what you see here is in the course of 2 generations, the global talent pool, the composition has fundamentally changed. You can see the United States, long #1, now an average performer. You can see Korea from the bottom of the league right up to the top, giving every young person sort of a school qualification. And the UK also has seen progress, but the progress has been less pronounced than in other countries. And actually, one of the points I want to make throughout this presentation is that standing still is actually meaning falling backwards in relative terms, because the world changes so fast. The benchmark for success is no longer just improvement by national standards or historical comparison, but really the best performing systems. Coming to higher education, every dot on this chart is one country. On the horizontal axis, I show you the graduate supply, first degrees. On the vertical axis, I show you how much it costs, cost per student. And to make the picture a bit more complicated, these days it's very important where the money comes from, and that's shown by the size of the dot. No? The larger the dot, the larger the private share in the financing of higher education. So, you can look at the United States, #1 in tertiary output, #1 in spending per student, and generating most of that money through the private purse. Japan, sort of similar case. Let's also briefly have a look at Finland, in the middle of the pack in terms of output, moderately expensive, and it's all paid by the public purse. The only thing I haven't emphasized so far is this was in 1995. And I want to show you how things changed. If you keep that picture in mind and you look at how the world looked in the year 2000, you could actually see that what was the benchmark for everybody, the United States, is now the frontier reached by many countries, and among them, the UK. You could see really how the UK progressed between 1995 and 2000 towards this frontier. Australia, another country, rapid expansion. And here you now see Finland, from the middle of the pack right to the frontier in terms of the graduate output. That doesn't tell you much about quality, it's just a quantitative expansion. And the world didn't stop in the year 2000 as some people had predicted. You could actually see in 2001 things looked like this. 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and so on. What I'm showing you simply is every country is moving forward, but the pace of change varied enormously across countries. You could see here, the United States has moved to the right, getting more people towards higher education completion, but many countries have moved past that point that was 10 years before sort of looked at by everyone as the benchmark. You can see here Australia, here Finland, here the United Kingdom. Also, you know, a lot of progress between 1995 and 2000, but since then sort of progress has slowed down, and basically many countries have been moving further and getting more people to complete their degrees. What does it mean for the future? Let me show you 2 things here. On the horizontal axis, I show you the proportion of the adult population who has attained a university qualification or equivalent. And on the vertical axis, I show you what differences between younger and older cohort mean in terms of the long-term talent pool. And you can mark in this corner, you can put those countries that have high attainment and that are going to see a bright future and getting a better and better qualified adult population. Many of the Asian countries, but sort of a mixed pool of countries. You have a number of countries that have lower attainment that are catching up because younger populations are better educated than older ones, quite significantly so. You have a group of countries that have lower attainment and risk to fall further behind because they don't sort of have this gap, the skill advantage among the younger population. And you have countries that basically still have high attainment, like the UK, but that have actually a rapidly decreasing advantage if you look at this in the long term throughout the next generation. One point I want to make is that it's not just about changes in the quantity of skills. It's also very much to do with the nature of skills that count for people. I don't have data for the UK. I'm showing you some data for the United States here, showing you just how the nature of the skills that are in demand or in use, let's put it like this, has changed. You can see basically in the 1960s and 70s, people built a lot of factories. Since then, we've seen a decline in routine manual labor. Everybody knows this. That's to do with automation and things like this. If you look at non-routine manual work, you can see sort of also a decline, but things have flattened out, and that's because many of those jobs, even if they're not highly skilled, they are difficult to automate, outsource, or digitize. No? Think of your hairdresser, you can't outsource it to India or China, no? Or you can't automate your bus driver. So there are lots of jobs that are actually quite stable. But the biggest decrease in the demand for skills actually has been in what we call routine cognitive skills. No? That's basically those kind of skills that are easiest to teach and easiest to digitize. Big increases in the demand in what we call non-routine analytic skills and non-routine interactive skills. I'm showing you this chart only because it's not just about more of the same, it's really also changes in the nature of skills. Now, the very interesting question, of course, is if there are more and more better qualified people, more and more people with university degree, will we end up having everybody having a university degree and work for the minimum wage? No? Sort of, is there going to be an inflation on the labor market value of degrees and qualifications? And actually the short answer is that that hasn't happened so far. It may happen in the future, but so far we have not seen any decline in the labor market advantage, rather the opposite. Very different from the low end of the skill spectrum. Now, the more people you put into the low end of the skill spectrum, the lower the earnings because the work there is fixed. Let me just show you sort of in terms of today's net present value. When people go to university, they pay tuition. Some countries a lot, in some countries less. The UK is sort of rising to the frontier there. Private share has risen quite remarkably. But tuition is still very, very small as a cost component compared to the foregone earnings. The big cost you incur when you study is not tuition. It's actually the earnings you lose during your studies. You also pay more taxes. No? I come back to this in a moment. No? When you're better qualified, you pay more taxes. That drags on your earnings to the negative side. You also pay more social contributions, same story, larger. But the earnings benefit is significantly wider. The UK is actually one of the countries where people draw most of the earning benefits from university study. There comes an employment benefit that's also associated with this. Actually, between 2008 and 2009, when the financial crisis hit, it was the employment benefit that increased most, not the earnings benefits. But you look at the balance sheet and you can see in most countries, in terms of net present value, the advantage is actually significant. That's on average across degrees. That doesn't separate now out between fields of study. Obviously, the gap is quite large there. But you can see in virtually every country, you talk about over 100,000 US dollars for a person. Now, it's good for individuals, and it has been increasing for individuals. In most countries, in green, I mark those countries where we have seen an increase in the earnings advantage. In yellow, where things have remained so-so, and in red, where there has been a decline, but there has been actually no country in the OECD with a significant decline. And look at some of the countries. My country, Germany, 37 percentage points increase in the earnings advantage in 1 decade. Those who are university educated are better and better off. Those who have just sort of a high school degree pay the price for that. Generally, you can see the picture is more green than red. You can see on average, we're still seeing rising earnings advantages for better qualified people. What are taxpayers? You can look at the public cost. Now, what do governments pay for higher education? This is marked by the red bar, and the red bar tends to get shorter because there's bigger private share, but it's still quite long in countries that are predominantly publicly financed. There's a lot of money going into public taxpayers' money into higher education. But there's also a lot of returns to taxpayers. That's basically the additional income that governments receive from better qualified people in the form of higher tax payments and lower social welfare payments. So you can actually see, again, governments make quite a bit of profit out of higher education graduates. In the UK, it's on average now about $95,000 per person coming out of the system, that governments get more in tax revenue than they pay. So what you see from both sides is there's a reason for individuals to continue studying, there's a reason for governments to finance higher education, and that explains what you saw before, this rapid rise in higher education participation. That's why we're not likely to see an end to this, at least on a global scale, because there are clear incentives for this. Now you can always ask, you know, to what extent is higher education really something that benefits economies, and to what extent is it because people like to do it, consumption? One way to look at this actually is to see how many university graduates actually end up working in qualified work, high-skilled work. Actually, I'm showing you here the opposite. I'm showing you here the share of tertiary graduates who work in semi-skilled or low-skilled occupation. And you can see there are some, but it's usually not more than a quarter. And this quarter is what you would typically expect, because there are a lot of people who do that by choice. They may have a high qualification, but they choose the part-time work or lower skilled work later on in their life. So that is something that is not so unexpected. So you can argue that most of the people, 3/4 of the people, or more than 3/4 of the people on average across countries, actually end up doing a high-skilled job. Now, you can look at this the other way around. You can say, well, if there are more and more higher qualified people, will those university graduates end up doing the work that previously was done by secondary school graduates? No. Will there be a displacement in the labor market? It's something very interesting also in the financial crisis to ask yourself. Interestingly, we don't see that yet. In most countries, the numbers for 2003, 2007, and 2009 have been fairly stable, which tells you that there has not yet been a displacement. In other words, we're seeing job growth accommodating higher qualified people rather than job displacement. That may all change at one point, but you know, this debate, if we had talked about this here 100 years ago about secondary education, people would have had the same debate. They would have said, well, how many people do you want to have school degrees? No? Today we have 40%, now do you want to have 60%, 80%? And that's sort of a debate that we have now, and the most rational way to answer this question is actually to look at the labor market incentives. When are those incentives going to change? When are we going to see a depreciation on the value? That's the moment when you have a saturation of the market. Labor costs is another way to look at things. This shows you basically the labor costs associated with different qualifications. The line is the OECD average. Here you can see university graduates, or tertiary graduates to be more precise. You can see in the United Kingdom they're quite expensive. In Poland they're very cheap. Slovak Republic, Hungary, Czech Republic, New Zealand, Spain, Greece, and so on. You can get university graduates for much lower prices. Wage levels are lower. UK is more on the expensive side. That's the relative prices for upper secondary graduates, high school graduates. And that's basically for those with low skills. And you can see the United Kingdom actually is a country where people with advanced qualifications are relatively more expensive than people with low qualifications, suggesting to you that there is certainly not an oversupply of highly qualified people. If you had an oversupply, you'd see the other way around, which you do see. I mean, if you look, for example, to Norway, it's all more or less the same. Everybody is expensive. If you look some other countries, but even Poland, it's very interesting. Poland, you could argue that the higher education graduates are very cheap on the labor market. Does it mean that they have too many? But no, you can actually see within the country, relatively speaking, things seems to be quite as much as you would expect them. But it's another indicator looking at sort of demand and supply. You can look at skills supply and the skills premium. I think that's also a very interesting picture. You see on the horizontal axis, the proportion of middle-aged people with a tertiary qualification. On the vertical axis, you look at the labor cost ratio. And you can actually see if the supply is poor. No? If you're on the left side of the chart, you can actually see how that drives up relative costs. No? So it's wonderful for the Koreans and the Portuguese and the Polish to earn a lot of money. But someone has to pay that bill, and that's actually employers. Sort of short of supply basically drives up labor costs. Once you get beyond sort of the middle range, it doesn't very much matter anymore. The United States is just a big market. Everybody wants to invest there. That's sort of a different factor that comes in, but things flatten out beyond that mark. You can do, I don't have the time here, you can do the same as foreign direct investment. You get a very, very similar picture that I've shown here. One point I wanted to look at briefly with you is sort of student mobility. This is sort of how the shares of students work out. And if you had looked at this chart 3 years, 5 years, 10 years ago, one thing you see is that it has grown rapidly. We have seen an increase in the foreign students across OECD countries by 11% in last year alone. Huge numbers, continuing rises from 3 to 3.3 million students now. The US gets the biggest share, and then comes the UK. And that's actually quite impressive because, of course, the US gets the biggest share largely because it's a big market. It's a large country. If you look at this in relative terms, things come out quite differently. But things have also changed. This is how things looked in 2000, the market share of OECD countries. And this is how things looked in 2008. You can see basically how the market share of the United States has dropped very significantly. True also for the UK, true also for Germany. Russia, I think, is the biggest winner in terms of expanding its share of foreign students. But these things change. You know, again, traditionally, the US and UK have been very much up front, but now sort of there are many countries that start to compete for foreign graduates, and you can see a changing picture. We had predicted some years ago that you would see a decline in foreign students internationally, because people built universities in China. Why would Chinese? Now basically you have 17% of all international students in the OECD are Chinese, but now that they're building universities, that might change. It hasn't happened so far because there are lots and lots of more people who have now money there to study, so we see that rising. I just wanted to show very briefly, look at this in relative terms, and there actually the UK does really well. Number one is Australia. Doesn't have a big market share because it's a small country, but in relative numbers, very, very successful in attracting foreign students. Austria as well, even though they usually get the neighboring countries because they offer studies for free with lower entry requirements than the neighboring countries, so that's just a sort of displacement factor. They don't make any money with this, but the Australians do. Then comes the UK, number 3, the third most successful country in attracting students, then Switzerland, New Zealand, Belgium, Canada, and so on. Also, these numbers change. I could have shown you some trend data here showing you that this also is not a static picture. Finally, who's paying for what, when, and how? That's obviously the intriguing question for everybody. You can look, first of all, at public expenditure, and you can actually not see huge differences. You can see countries like Finland, Denmark, Canada, Sweden, Switzerland putting a lot of public money into higher education, but then the rest doesn't vary very much. Now, I've highlighted here the United States and the United Kingdom, and you can see that isn't actually very different. But once you add the private share to this, you see the difference. No? That's why, on average, US students have about twice the resources than students in Europe, largely because of a very, very large proportion of private share that isn't mobilized in Europe. That is much more prominent in Korea, Japan, United States, Chile, and so on, Canada. These are the sources of funds. It's just the OECD average. This has also not remained static. There's been a lot of change. And if you look at the change alone between 2000 and 2007 in the volume of money being put into higher education, you can see the UK is at the very end, that the UK actually did fare quite well. was one of the countries with the most rapidly expanding financial base. This is the number of change in the number of students, and that's what it means in terms of unit costs. You can see actually that the UK is the clear winner between 2000 and 2007 in rises in spending per student. This doesn't mean that the United Kingdom spends a lot, because it's still just reaching the average spending of OECD countries. But certainly it has fared very, very well over last years. You can see other countries at the bottom end where you can see there have been spending increases, but they have largely been eaten up by even faster rising student numbers. So unit costs in a relatively short period of time have seen quite dramatic changes. This is just total spending. And now you'll be surprised. Now you saw this rapid increase, but this is basically spending on teaching in the UK being really low. Why is that? A, because there's a sizable amount of auxiliary services and research and development. The money that is accounted for includes in the UK a much higher share of research money, leaving less for teaching. You have some countries where we can't make that distinction, and that's basically, I think I got the OECD average in there. But the UK more or less is on OECD average. So basically what has happened in the last decade is that the UK has risen towards the OECD average, but is certainly not a high spending country, and actually is a low spending country when you look at the money that actually gets into classrooms, sort of teaching in universities. Finally, and this is going to be my last slide, this higher education, university education is obviously not everything. There's a lot of learning going on beyond that. And we have been trying to measure this as well, learning in formal or non-formal education. And you can see the UK does well on that. When you just look at the incidence of people studying either in a company or elsewhere, you can see actually a sizable proportion of people, about 50%, half of the people, do some kind of continuing education and training. So there's a lot of provision. However, if you look who does it, these are the university graduates, no? These are the school graduates, and these are those without baseline qualifications. So in a sense, those who need that kind of training most get the least out of it, whereas the main beneficiaries of continuing education and training are those who are well educated. Not a surprise, but coming out quite nicely in the data. So the UK being relatively successful in that kind of training, but when you look at this in intensity terms, the UK comes actually at the end. So what does that mean? A lot of people do lots of things, but usually very short courses. This is basically employers saying, I want you to have this kind of specialized skill tomorrow, go to that course and you get it. Not employers saying, I'm going to invest in your long-term human capital and so on, which is what you have in Korea, the Nordic countries, or some other countries. So it's very important to keep that in mind, that incidence of formal education training isn't everything. If you want to look at the long-term establishment of human capital, the intensity is another important measure. What this shows you essentially is that continuing education and training, at least in the UK, is certainly not a displacement or replacement for formal education. What do we draw out from this? Some conclusions. In the current economic environment, we are seeing a continued strong demand for education, actually an increased demand for education. Has to do with poor labor markets on the one hand, but also with low opportunity costs. You know, if education would be an enterprise, this is the moment people would buy it, would invest in it. The opportunity costs are low for the individuals. If you don't make good money on the labor market, you invest in your own education. The same is true for governments. Probably one of the things, and that's happened in a number of countries actually. We have been studying the stimulus packages across countries or the new budgets, and actually there have been a fair number of OECD countries that have spared education from spending cuts out of those kinds of arguments. We see that there are substantial public and private gains from education. The earnings premium for university remains large and in most countries continues to grow. The public long-term gains from higher education are almost 3 times the size of public investments. Fiscal returns, taxpayers' returns, 3 times as much as tax payments. Long-term, though. And that's where the problem is. You get that money only over the lifetime of people. You have to spend it now. High skills are a key to competitiveness. You've seen the data on the comparative cost advantage across countries. We have seen labor market entry becoming more difficult in a number of countries, not in all, but particularly for low-educated young individuals. If you look at who's been hit by the recent financial crisis, it's very interesting when you look at those data, 2008, 2009, you can really see that unemployment in most countries has not affected tertiary graduates, only marginally. The big impact has been actually for those without baseline qualifications. That's something that's not going to go away because the risk of long-term employment when those people compete with the next generation of graduates is actually very high. What does that mean? Educational attainment is likely to rise further, and continuing education probably is going to see growing importance of this. I leave it here so that we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.